Yes. All right, maybe there's like a little bit more to it than that, but let's switch onto this lens so that you can see what the video footage looks like as we're going through this review. 1 second. I'd assume that there's 3 reasons why people would think about this lens potentially as something they'd want to use professionally. The first being the size and weight. It is really, really light. It's very comfortable, especially if you're using something like the ZF, which is what I'm filming on now. I would say the next thing would probably be the look. Because of that size and weight and the look of it, it feels in that kind of retro-inspired vibe. And I think because of that, it is a little bit easier to take photos with it when people are maybe a little bit uncomfortable, in front of a camera. Because something like this 40mm f2 compared to the 50mm f1.2 is a very, very big difference in terms of the intensity of being photographed by it. The 51.2 is unbelievable, but it's a lot of lens to be staring at you if you're not comfortable. And thirdly is the price. If it can do a good job at this price point, then I think we are compelled by that because camera gear is expensive, and if we can get something that is lower cost and still great quality, why wouldn't we want that? So the question is, does it hold up professionally? Is it something you can use in a professional setting? Yes, like I said, of course, you can use any lens for professional work. If somebody will pay you to use that lens and like the images that you get out of it, then yes is the answer. But it's a little more nuanced than that, and the reality is it depends. It depends on a few different things. So let's quickly go through the lens and talk about each of the kind of big categories people like to know about, and then we'll talk about what this lens is good for and what I would probably shy away from. Now I keep holding up this lens even though we're filming on the 40mm because this is the 28mm and it looks basically exactly the same. Ergonomics wise, it's exactly the same. Like I said, there's no dials or switches. There's no extra like control ring or anything like that, or aperture ring. You have your focus ring and that is it. It's built fine. Like it doesn't feel super cheap, but it does not feel premium. I really like the knurling that's on the focus ring. I think it's kind of weird that it looks like it has an extra control ring, but it doesn't. That's strange, but overall it's a nice feeling lens. In terms of like dust sealing, weather sealing, it's nominal. I would say I've used this out in the snow and a bit of rain and stuff. I haven't had any issues, but definitely a little bit of dust gets in there. And so you're not gonna wanna bring it on like torrential downpour, maybe? I don't know, it depends on how much you care about that. Do you wanna ruin your camera? I don't know, it's up to you. The one thing I will say is that given that this was sort of redesigned in this SE style to go with the ZF, it would have been cool if there was an aperture ring. That would unlock some extra usability for me in the way that I use the ZF, but I understand the price point. An aperture ring is probably not gonna happen. Next up, autofocus, something people really care about. I would say the autofocus on it is pretty reliable. Overall, it captures most of the images I'm trying to get with it. Sometimes it hunts around a little bit, sometimes it's not perfect, but the question of whether that's more to do with the ZF or more to do with the lens is maybe a little bit up for debate. What I will say is when I put something like the 50mm f1.8s on the ZF, I do find it a little bit more reliable. So I'll say that it's pretty good. It gets less reliable, I think, as you get closer. In this sort of mid-distance that we're at right now, I find it's very good. It can track well. I don't find it hunts or moves around a ton. When I get really close, I think that's where I find if I'm at its close to its minimum focal distance, but not necessarily like right up to it, I'd say that it hunts a little bit more. Now, if you're shooting something a little bit wider or open like that, you're not gonna have any issues with it. The sweet spot seems to be around that 4 to 10 feet away, as well as maybe near infinity, but not quite infinity, seems to be pretty solid too. I will say, if there's a lot of forward and backwards, this lens can sometimes like hunt a little bit and not be able to quite keep up. But I mean, it depends on what you're shooting. I don't have a lot of that happening this close to the lens that's an issue. If that's happening further away, it doesn't really seem to cause any issues. So the autofocus is good, it's totally fine. For professional work, I'd say you'd be okay. And image quality. So this one is tricky because image quality is kind of relative to what you need out of it, right? So I will say that wide open, it's a little bit soft. If we look at these photos here of this ring, Tortured Poets Department ring, Taylor Swift fans out there, get at me. If we look at this image here, we can see that at f2, it is pretty soft. We're at not quite the minimum focus distance, but we're pretty close to it. So that may be, a factor here, but you can see that we can't get super close to our images. So in no way is this gonna be like a macro lens, but the image quality is just a little soft. If we bump up to f4, you can see that it does clean up quite a bit in the center. I think it is starting to look nice and sharp. At f8, we see an even greater improvement, and that's where it starts to fall off a bit. I I bumped up to f16. You can see some diffraction taking place and just not looking as sharp or quite as good as the f8. So I would say your sort of like f4 to f8 zone is really nice and sharp, like most lenses, and especially more budget lenses. That's going to be the case. At f2 wide open, it's a little bit soft. However, I will say that the look of it at f2 is nice. I used it for some portraits. You can see here, I used it on a shoot yesterday, and I was liking the images I was getting out of it. Are they the sharpest? Definitely not. But are they sharp enough for what they're going to be used for? I would say for sure. It's not quite as sharp as I'd like it to be, but again, I don't really care about that too much for the stuff I do. Being super sharp at the corners of my image are just not a priority to me. There's a fair amount of vignetting, there's some chromatic aberrations, stuff like that, but that's easily corrected, and usually I'm not correcting that unless I'm trying to do a really like clean professional look, which is not most of the stuff that I shoot. I will say that the softness of this lens at f2 sometimes makes you feel like maybe you missed focus a little bit, but when you zoom in, you can tell that no, it focused, it's just not super sharp. And so that's where, you know, stopping down to f4, f5.6 is great. The bokeh is nice. It's not anything special to write home about, but it is pleasing. It's good. The fall off's good. The one thing I will say is that, so this lens, this actual lens, not the fake 40 I have in my hand, but the actual lens here, the 28mm f2.8, it has, people talk about this idea of like 3D pop. There's like a dimension to this lens, wide open, that is really interesting. And I'll throw up a photo here, just a quick snap that I took the other day, that like, at 28mm, it's just so interesting how much the subject kind of comes off the image, and I think it's really cool. And I don't get that as much with the 40mm. I think it's a nice looking image, but it's not like special. All right, so professional work. Is it a lens that you want to use professionally? I would say there's scenarios where it's really good. So for example, I've shot a few weddings with this lens, and during cocktail, during dance, during like times when I want to get a lot of candid stuff, it's really nice to have this tiny little lens on my ZF and be able to just like move around super quickly, easily snap photos. It's a lot of fun. It made taking photos really enjoyable. So what do we think of this? Not bad, right? Do you wanna? Yeah, that's the 28mm actually. One. It's gonna be plenty sharp for a lot of things. And if you're mainly shooting for people's socials, for Instagram, for like, you know, some websites and stuff, it's gonna be sharp enough. That's not gonna be a problem. It depends. If you're going into print or you're doing anything that's advertising, maybe you want something a little bit sharper. It's up to you really, but just know that that's what's probably gonna hold you back from wanting this lens. Also, if you're shooting something like sports or something like that, I don't know that 40mm is gonna be your go-to, but is it going to be able to keep up with the autofocus speed you need? I would say most of the time, yes, but if you're doing like crazy dynamic movements and stuff, it might be a little bit more difficult. Should you have this in your bag? Yeah, I think you should. And the reason you should is because it's a great backup to like a 50mm or a 35mm if you need it. It also just gives a slightly different point of view. So if you love the 50mm and you want to challenge yourself a little bit to try something new, one of the reasons I was so excited about picking up the ZF was getting the 28 and the 40, because these are two of my favorite focal lengths to shoot on. And I just think it's so cool that they have these lenses ready to go and they match the vibe and the feel. Keep this lens in your bag because you never know when you're gonna get tired of carrying that hefty, you know, 51.4 or 1.2, and you just need a break and you want to be able to just go around and snap some photos when you're at an event or something, but you don't want to have like a big thing with you. And finally, I would just say when you want to be less conspicuous, you're at like cocktail hour or you're at a event where people maybe are not totally used to getting photos taken, this is a really nice little lens to have to not overwhelm people. They'll just think you're some dude with a camera who's like hanging out at the event. They won't think like, oh, big professional photographer. So that can be helpful too. So what about you? Do you have this lens? This is the 28mm. Do you have this lens? Do you have the 40mm lens? Do you like it? How are you using it? Do you use it for professional work? Like I said, I think it's totally usable. You just got to know what you're using it for. And that's about it. I'm gonna go to work now. Bye.